The official history of our cities is written in stone and steel. But what if its most important chapters are buried right beneath our feet? The old buildings we see every day hold a secret. Many have noticed a strange peculiarity. Windows on the first floors that descend directly into the ground, or doors that lead nowhere, into the solid wall of a sidewalk. This is usually explained away by cultural layers or soil subsidence. But what if the truth is far more immense and unsettling? What if entire cities were buried not over centuries, but as the result of some swift and global event? This proposition raises a series of questions that official history fails to answer clearly. The first and most obvious is, just how deep were these buildings buried? We're not talking about a few inches accumulated over centuries. Old photographs taken in various cities across the United States show us something entirely different. We see buildings buried under 5, 6, and sometimes even 23 feet of soil. That's the height of an entire first or even a second floor. Imagine a majestic stone structure with only its upper portion sticking out of the ground, like an iceberg hiding its true mass beneath the surface. This leads us to the second question. If cities were indeed buried by such a colossal volume of earth, how and by what means were they excavated in the 19th and early 20th centuries? We're talking about millions of cubic yards of soil that had to be removed without damaging the existing structures. This would be a titanic effort, even for modern heavy machinery, let alone for the age of steam engines. What technologies allowed for work on such a scale? And why is this grand unearthing of America not commonly discussed in history books? The third question logically follows the second. Where did all that earth disappear to? You can't just move a mountain of soil without leaving a trace. If millions of tons of earth were removed from a city center, they had to be deposited somewhere. This process would have required incredible logistics, comparable to the construction of the cities themselves. However, there is virtually no evidence of giant dumps or artificial hills being created. The earth simply vanished, as if it had evaporated. The fourth question makes you wonder about the motivation. Why undertake such a monumental task at all? Why didn't people just start living on the new ground level, adapting to the changed conditions? Why was it necessary to invest unimaginable resources into digging out the lower floors, turning them into basements, and restoring the original street level? There must have been an extremely compelling reason to justify this colossal expenditure of effort and resources.
And finally, the fifth, most important and most difficult question. What force could have buried entire cities? What kind of cataclysm could move such enormous masses of soil and cover urban areas over vast territories? This wasn't a slow accumulation of dust and debris. By all appearances, it was a rapid and powerful event, the nature of which remains a mystery. To try and find answers, we will begin our investigation in two completely different cities whose histories are documented in old photographs. The first is Seattle, a major port city on the Pacific coast. The second is Kansas City, located in the very heart of the continent, thousands of miles from the nearest sea, at an altitude of almost 900 feet. Their geographical locations are radically different, but they share the same incredible story. A story of cities that once had to be literally dug out from under the ground. What we will see there defies all logic and forces us to look at the past in a new light. Our investigation begins in Seattle, and old photographs of the city immediately immerse us in an atmosphere of something surreal and inexplicable. This isn't just a city, it's a landscape that seems to have undergone some colossal transformation. Imagine a city street lined with solid, well-built houses. Now imagine that next to these houses, right in the middle of the city, rise giant cliffs of earth. These aren't gentle hills, but nearly vertical walls of compacted soil whose flat tops suggest that this was once a single higher ground level. The buildings stand at the foot of these cliffs, like archaeological artifacts just brought to light. In other photos, we see an even stranger picture. Entire houses, sometimes several stories high, stand on top of these earthen mounds, which are nearly as tall as the buildings themselves. They look as though they were carefully cut out of the main landmass along with their foundations. Some of these structures stand at a noticeable tilt, as if the ground beneath them had begun to sink or was partially washed away, and they are about to collapse into the resulting chasm. What on earth was happening here? One gets the feeling that the city was literally breaking through a thick layer of earth, freeing itself from captivity. The scenes are so phantasmagorical that they make you doubt their reality, were it not for one thing. These are authentic documentary photographs.
But if the views of Seattle seem strange, what we find in Kansas City, located in the heart of the continent, is simply shocking. Here, there's no hint of coastal landslides or the topography of a waterfront. Nevertheless, we see the very same picture, only on an even more frightening scale. One photograph captures a massive stone building buried in soil right up to its roof. Only the upper part of the structure is visible, while everything else, windows, doors, entire floors, is hidden under an incredible thickness of earth. This isn't a hill standing in front of the building. This is a building buried inside a hill. Another picture from Kansas, dated 1867, allows us to appreciate the scale of the burial in numbers. It shows the corner of a large stone building covered on its side by soil to the height of 2 full, high-ceilinged floors. That's about 4 times the height of a person, totaling around 23 feet. 23 feet of dense clay and earth that hid a significant part of the city. These enormous volumes of soil burying stone structures could not have appeared on their own. It is at this moment, looking at this irrefutable visual evidence, that we encounter the first serious contradiction. These photographs are not fakes. They're documented and are part of the official histories of these cities. And of course, this history has its own explanation. We are told of street regrading, taming the terrain, and large-scale improvement projects. Seattle city engineer, a Mr. Thompson, supposedly took advantage of the Great Fire to level the glacial hills that hindered the city's development. In Kansas, we're told about the removal of clay banks to pave the streets. But can these seemingly routine engineering tasks explain what we see? Could a street leveling project result in a building being buried up to its roof? Seeing the scale of what happened, these official explanations begin to seem unconvincing, as if they describe only the effect, not the true cause. It's as if they tell the story of how the earth was removed, but remain silent about where it came from in such unimaginable quantities. To understand what really happened, we first need to figure out how the cities got rid of these gigantic volumes of earth. After all, the excavation process, captured in the very same photographs, was no less impressive than the burials themselves. Studying the methods and technologies used for this titanic work may shed light on the true nature of the soil and perhaps on the cause of this whole mysterious story. The process was no less impressive than the aftermath itself.
Looking at the photographs of the buried cities, we inevitably ask ourselves, how is it even possible to cope with such a volume of work? The answer, captured in those same images, is astonishing in its industrial scale. This wasn't just clearing debris, it was a true war against the soil, and the most advanced technologies of the time were mobilized for it. At the forefront of this battle were steam shovels, true steel monsters, hissing with steam and clanking with metal. They weren't just brought to the work site. Temporary railway tracks were laid for them right on the city streets, among the existing buildings. Picture this scene. In the middle of a city street, on a section of rails with ties, stands a huge excavator, and, scoop by scoop, it bites into the multi-yard thick layer of earth, loading it into the wagons of a train waiting right there. Entire trains worked like a giant conveyor belt, hauling the soil out of the excavated areas. Besides trains, other marvels of engineering were used. Long conveyor belts. These mechanisms, sometimes enclosed in wooden casings, snaked through the entire city, carrying a continuous stream of earth over vast distances. In one of the photographs, we see such an enclosed belt leading directly to the harbor, which clearly demonstrates the final destination of this whole process. The entire operation was organized with astonishing efficiency. Heavy machinery removed the soil, and a complex logistics system immediately carried it away. One photo even captures a celebratory moment. A crowd of people gathered to witness an excavator take the last scoop of mud, completing another stage of the city's redevelopment. But alongside these quite understandable methods, the photographs show something much stranger and more mysterious: the widespread use of powerful jets of water. We see numerous pictures where people are spraying vertical walls of soil with what look like giant fire hoses. The official caption for one such photograph reads, "Regrading the streets of Seattle." But this explanation raises more questions than it answers. Why use water? Turning tons of earth into slurry is an extremely inefficient way to work. Mud complicates the movement of machinery, creates chaos, and requires additional effort for its collection and removal. One might suggest that the water was used to keep the dust down. But in many photographs where excavators are working, there is no water. Conversely, in the pictures with water cannons, there are often no other earthworks visible that could be creating this dust. It seems that washing the soil away with water was not an auxiliary, but the primary method of dealing with this specific type of ground. This method seems strange and illogical for ordinary earth, but it could have been perfect if this earth had some special properties.
And this brings us to the question of the final fate of all this excavated soil. Where did the millions of cubic yards of earth go? The photographs provide the answer once again. This entire colossal volume, collected by excavators, transported by trains, and washed away by water, was ultimately transported to the sea. There, it was loaded onto huge barges, which moved away from the shore and simply capsized, dumping their cargo onto the seabed. The scale of this operation is staggering. This wasn't just a redesign of the city, but a systematic removal and destruction of a giant part of its landscape. And again, we return to the main question. What made people undertake such a colossal effort? Why was it necessary not just to level the hills, but to dump them into the sea? And it is here, while searching for answers in Seattle's official history, that we stumble upon one extremely interesting detail. A key phrase that could turn our entire understanding of what happened upside down. In the documents describing Engineer Thompson's project, the hills that were so diligently leveled and washed away are called glacial hills. At first glance, this is just a geographical term indicating the origin of the terrain. But what if it's not just a fancy name? What if we are meant to take these words literally? The term glacial hills sounds like a simple geological formality, but what if it holds the key to the entire mystery? What if it's not a metaphor or a scientific term describing events of millennia ago, but a direct, literal description of what these hills were at the beginning of the 20th century? At first, this idea seems absurd. Permafrost in Seattle? The city is located at the 47th parallel, on the same latitude as Rostov-on-Don in Russia. It's a region with a temperate maritime climate that has snowy winters, but permafrost is out of the question. Theoretically, it could have been there, but how could it exist at such a latitude? It contradicts all the laws of climatology. However, this contradiction disappears as soon as we turn our gaze north to Alaska. Let's recall how gold was mined there during the same era. The gold-bearing layer often lay beneath a thick layer of so-called muck, a frozen mass of soil, ice, peat, and the twisted remains of trees and animals. To get to the precious metal, miners first had to get rid of this permafrost. And how did they do it? Digging it with an excavator was almost impossible. Instead, they used the most effective method known. They washed the frozen ground away with powerful jets of water from hydraulic monitors. Water under immense pressure didn't just wash the earth away, it thawed it, turning the rock-hard mass into a liquid slurry that could then be directed into sluices.
Now, let's mentally return to the surreal photographs from Seattle, where people are spraying giant walls of earth with similar powerful hoses. The method is absolutely identical to the one used by gold miners in Alaska. This no longer seems like a simple coincidence. If Seattle used the same highly specific and labor-intensive method as the one for dealing with permafrost, it's logical to assume they were working with the same material. This insight allows us to formulate an incredible yet surprisingly coherent hypothesis. What if, relatively recently, perhaps only 100, 200 years ago, the coast where Seattle would later be built was hit by a giant ice tsunami? This wasn't just a wave of water. It was a colossal, moving mass of ice shards, mud, silt from the ocean floor, and the ground-up remains of everything in its path. This monstrous wave swept across the land, burying the landscape and everything on it. And then, due to the enormous amount of ice in its composition, this slurry of mud and ice froze, forming what was later called glacial hills. This wasn't true geological permafrost that had formed over millennia, but a kind of flash permafrost, the result of a single catastrophic event. This hypothesis explains everything at once: the colossal volume of soil that suddenly appeared in the city, the strange method of its removal using water, which was essentially a thawing process, and even the name Glacial Hills itself. Building on such an unstable, thawing surface was impossible, so it had to be washed away and dumped into the sea. This version seems surprisingly coherent and logical. It ties together all the strange facts concerning Seattle. But it has one fundamental flaw. It is completely shattered by geography. It can explain what happened in a coastal city, but it is absolutely helpless before the mystery of Kansas City. This city is located thousands of miles from the ocean, in the very center of the continent, at an altitude of 884 feet above sea level. No tsunami, not even the most unimaginable one in the planet's history, could have reached it. Yet the buildings there were buried to the same, if not greater depth. This means that some other, not less powerful force was at play in Kansas. Does this mean a different catastrophe occurred there, but led to the exact same result?
The ice tsunami hypothesis, which so elegantly explains the anomalies in Seattle, crumbles to dust when faced with the geography of Kansas City. This city is a veritable fortress, protected from any conceivable aquatic cataclysm. It's located in the very heart of the continent, at an altitude of nearly 900 feet above sea level. To flood it would require a wave of biblical proportions that would have had to sweep across half of North America without losing its power, a scenario that defies any laws of physics. The local river, which flows deep in a gorge, could not have caused a disaster of this magnitude either. Burying a city under 23 feet of soil is not a spring flood. This means we must look for a completely different explanation for Kansas City. The cause had to be different. And once again, old photographs give us a clue. Early images of Kansas City, taken at the very beginning of its excavation, show a very strange landscape. It is uneven, undulating, reminiscent of either underwater sand dunes or the frozen waves of desert dunes. This terrain doesn't look like it was covered by a layer of wet mud or silt brought by water. Rather, it looks like it was buried under a huge mass of something loose and dry. What is also striking in these photographs is the almost complete absence of mature, old trees.
we see only a few young saplings. This indirectly suggests that not so long ago, perhaps 50 years before the photo was taken, this was a practically barren area, devoid of vegetation that could have restrained the movement of soil. These observations lead us to a second hypothesis. What if the central regions of the continent fell victim to a completely different element, air? What if these lands were hit by dust or sandstorms of unimaginable apocalyptic force? We know that wind is a powerful geological force, capable of transporting millions of tons of sand and dust over vast distances. History knows of the Dust Bowl in the United States in the 1930s, when monstrous storms carried away the fertile topsoil from the fields of entire states. What if, in the past, an event occurred that far surpassed even the Dust Bowl in its power and scale? What if it was a whole series of catastrophic storms that lasted for years or decades, methodically burying everything in its path?
This hypothesis perfectly explains a key feature of the buried cities that didn't fit the tsunami theory: the preservation of the buildings. A giant wave of water carrying ice and debris possesses colossal, destructive kinetic energy. It wouldn't have just buried the cities, it would have wiped them off the face of the earth. But a sandstorm acts differently. It doesn't strike, it engulfs. Billions of grains of sand, driven by the wind, slowly but relentlessly accumulate against the walls of buildings, burying streets, windows, and doors, gradually interring the city without destroying its structure. The buildings survived precisely because there was no impact force. They were encased in a kind of sandy sarcophagus, which preserved them until people began to dig them out. To understand what this might have looked like, we don't even need to look far back in history. We can just look at a modern example, the northern village of Shoina in Russia, where the world's northernmost desert is slowly but surely swallowing houses, burying them up to their roofs. Sand pours through windows and covers the streets, turning the village into a ghost town. This is a clear demonstration of how the element of air can bury a civilization. So now we have two completely different, yet in their own way, logical and convincing hypotheses explaining the same phenomenon in different regions. For coastal Seattle, it's an ice tsunami that brought a huge mass of mud and ice. For continental Kansas City, it's apocalyptic sandstorms that covered everything with loose soil. But the very fact that we need two different theories gives rise to an even more global and unsettling question. What does this mean on a larger scale? Our investigation, which began with the study of old photographs, has led us to two, at first glance, mutually exclusive conclusions. We can no longer speak of a single universal cause for the burial of cities. The picture has turned out to be much more complex and multifaceted. For coastal regions like Seattle, the ice tsunami hypothesis looks strikingly convincing. It explains the sudden appearance of huge masses of soil, its specific glacial character, and the strange method of its removal with water cannons, which was essentially a thawing process. It was a catastrophe born of the ocean, powerful, swift, and cold.
But for cities in the interior of the continent, like Kansas City, this version simply doesn't work. Here, a different element was the culprit. The undulating terrain, the absence of old trees, and the incredible preservation of the buildings under many feet of deposits point to a completely different scenario. Here the element was air. Apocalyptic dust storms, raging perhaps for more than 1 year, lifted entire landscapes into the air and buried a civilization beneath them. It was a slow, suffocating catastrophe that did not destroy, but engulfed. It turns out that depending on the geography, terrain, and elevation, cities fell victim to different but equally destructive forces. It would seem we have found answers, but in reality, it is this very conclusion that brings us to the main, most large-scale mystery. If there wasn't a single cause, then we are faced with an even more disturbing question. What kind of global event could have occurred on our planet about 150 to 200 years ago that triggered a chain reaction of such diverse cataclysms all over the world? This no longer looks like a series of local incidents. It looks like the symptoms of a single global failure in the planetary system. What could have caused the oceans to overflow their shores in giant icy waves and at the same time strip the topsoil from the continents, turning it into airborne sand? What force could have so radically and so quickly changed the climate, causing tsunamis in some places and unprecedented sandstorms in others? We don't have the answer. It could have been a cosmic impact, the fall of a large asteroid that caused tectonic shifts and threw billions of tons of dust into the atmosphere. It could have been a series of supervolcano eruptions that plunged the world into a volcanic winter, or some other event that our civilization has chosen to forget, erasing it from official history and leaving only vague hints in the form of street regrading and taming the terrain. We started with a simple question about buried windows and arrived at a global mystery, at the possible existence of an entire forgotten chapter in human history. It becomes clear that cities all over the world were not just dug out, they were being brought back to life after a catastrophe whose scale we are only beginning to comprehend. Old buildings cease to be just architecture. They become silent witnesses, artifacts that have survived something unimaginable. Their buried floors are the scars on the body of our civilization, reminders of an event that changed the face of the planet. We haven't found the final answer, but we have discovered the true scale of the question. And it seems we are on the verge of a great discovery, because the greatest secrets of history often lie not in ancient manuscripts, but right beneath our feet, waiting for the day we decide to dig them up.